Hi, everybody. Welcome to season 2 of Are We Our Work? Are We Our Work is an ongoing research project and anthology series that continues to evolve from season to season. Season 1 was concerned with our careers. Season 2 is focused more on love, the different formations that love can take, from romantic to platonic to familial, and how these intertwine with work, and then eventually how that impacts us and how we change through or with these relationships. Season 2 is the season of twos. We have two co hosts. One, yours truly, myself, Gimu Busielo. I work in public relations, specifically looking at tech. And in my off time, I think quite deeply about personal relations. I'm joined by my wonderful co host.
I am Nadia Patel. I'm an artist, I'm a designer.
So, season 2 sees Tiffany Ibrahim, a researcher, scholar, brains behind Are We Our Work, sit with a range of practitioners, or rather, a range of people. I want to humanize them. They share vulnerabilities, intimacies, concerns, anxieties.
So today, this was such an interesting one actually. Today we delve into the world of our guests, Nisha Merritt and Thati Pele. Nisha and Thati bring us into their worlds through their work and research in their respective thesis projects, more specifically. So, in this episode, we focus on the thesis projects by Nisha and Thati as retrospective research work and something that led Nisha and Thati to new geographical places. They speak about their relationships to Berlin, Joburg, and New York, and they take us into the worlds of these two characters, Sophie and Lerato.
Right. I was wondering who Sophie and Lerato were.
It's an interesting way to title the episode, also, to title by their characters, the characters that are central in their research. You kind of think you're going to listen to an interview between someone named Sophie and someone named Lerato.
Interesting, because Lerato means love as well,
Which
anchors
fits
us
so
in the season.
perfectly in the season. Absolutely. The labor of love that is also a thesis project. And so these two main characters, Sophie and Lerato, become the lens through which we engage with the practices of Nisha and Thati as independent makers, thinkers in the world.
I really like this idea of using the thesis as a lens into our guests. Who is Thati? Who is Nisha?
Yes. Nisha is an independent curator and writer. The title of Nisha's thesis is Constructing the Self, Sophie and the Negotiation of Space, and it was published by the Wits School of Arts in 2017. And she focuses on the work of South African artist Mary Sibande. And Thati is a film director. Her short film that we speak about is titled Lerato, and it was released in 2015 as her master's thesis at New York University's Tisch School of the Arts.
Cool. This is exciting.
So let's listen to the episode. And following that, I sat down with Tiffany to reflect on this conversation. Yeah.
All right. Sounds like a really intriguing episode.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, I love Berlin. Berlin will always be my home, so much more where I grew up. Everything I experienced there helped carve out my personality.
Nisha, let's talk magazine, the experience of paging through something. You also delivered your thesis, as I read. I didn't touch it or see it myself, but in a handmade envelope, and you had wrapped it in a certain way, and it was a gift almost that your reader and your supervisor had to unveil.
The magazine came very much from me reading. As a child, you could have I sat there for hours just like being immersed in the written word. So wanting to recreate that with my thesis. So everything I went through, reading, researching, putting all of that together, I wanted it to become physical. And that's why it was the idea of a magazine with the transparent tracing paper in between. I had blank pages in there.
Yes.
And I had written, I think this page was left blank
Intentionally.
So I wanted to build up all these multi-layers of understanding what I try to convey, because the written word wasn't enough.
And then the other conversation I want to have is very much about your character. You were so specific about how you're exploring the world of Sophie, obviously via Mary Sibande, but Sophie in particular was your protagonist per se.
Wow, it's such an interesting way of going back to that time, because I haven't reread my thesis since then. I finished it and I was like, I can't look at it again. This reminds me of how art always helped me to make sense of the world, because it is not clearly prescribed, because it has all these weirdness in it, and it has this wide range of interpretation. And yet art was always something, without being an artist myself, but something that I could use, that I can hold on to while I'm getting lost in this world. And Sophie was this character for me. Sophie was my entry into South Africa's history. How the artist Mary Sibande was the first person in her family able to decide what she wants to do. She goes back to where her mother and her grandmother came from and the situation they had. And I felt very much that was a good way of understanding my surrounding more and more, of being this person that has no connection to the country's history.
You talk about a range of artists and a range of works, and you display them photographically as well. But you always would come back to Sophie, the everyday, unrecognized domestic worker. On your use of Sophie, you talk about Sibande as somebody who draws connections and makes things visible, especially space and labor, whose nature often goes unseen, unknown, and unrecognized. Can you tell me a little bit about why Sophie and her particular form of labor was the person and the thing you gravitated towards?
Females still are so often looked at and not necessarily seen, also from within. Like, I think we as women often make ourselves invisible, carrying, being there, being the supporting role, but not really defining our work as a specific work that can be looked at, that can be quantified, that can be valued. I was thinking a lot lately about love as a skill, or as something you can trade. What if we would be capable of quantifying love? Would it not also allow us to negotiate love better, as making something and saying, I give this? Not to say it should be a business transaction. Love shouldn't be a business transaction. But I think often that goes unnoticed. And often that is a female position. That love, nurturing, caring, being there, having ideas. And then it's often a male position who then takes that
it.
or uses that environment to do something that then can be translated into something quantifiable, and therefore it becomes real. And so it's definitely Sophie embodies that general womanhood that I find often very difficult, and I wanted to also step out of that on a personal basis, wanting to carve out my own destiny, my own life and work, and who am I, and all of that, wanting to be seen in a way, also seeing myself. Yeah, that's the kind of like the invisibility.
Can I touch on something there? I also find it interesting that with Sibande's themes being invisibility and her portraying the unrecognized woman as her subject, but it was a time where she as an artist was blowing up and was, if anything, quite hyper visible. Had just won her Artists Award, had gotten a lot of her funding, and Sophie started to be publicly printed on the city of Joburg. If you would drive through the inner city, you would see Sophie on buildings. I'm wondering if you could just reflect on her subjects talking about what isn't recognized, but her as the artist or as the voice. Suddenly, she was becoming famous. There's a tension there. I think it would be disingenuous to conflate who Sophie is and who Mary is.
It's the trickiness of the art world in general. Artists do the work, and then they have only so much authority of that work when it enters into a public stage, when it enters into an art market, in a way that was beautiful for Mary Sibande as an artist to be pushed and to be recognized as such. It became performative suddenly for Sophie. She had to reaffirm something that I think gets sometimes lost if you blow something up so much.
Interesting.
The story of Sophie is so nuanced and so grounded in so many real people's lives and experiences and pasts that you do, I think, lose that if you do that. But at the same time, it's also an artist's career. It's also amazing that Sophie suddenly inhabited all these platforms and all these spaces and buildings and was visible, and you couldn't escape from her gaze. And she was capable of looking back. That is a beautiful way of making people uncomfortable because now they cannot not look at it. So it's difficult to say the one or the other is better or worse because they both have merit. But I think when you come back to Sophie as that character carrying all of that burden, then making her hyper visible creates that performativity that goes into that spectacle. But on the other hand, it gives her that space, the voice, and that unapologeticness that I think also it needed for a broader conversation.
I'm also curious about how Mary Svande's work influenced your relationship with Joburg. You say specifically in your dissertation, which was published in March 2017, that Johannesburg to you was a city that you fell in love with for its complex beauty.
Complex beauty for me is it's kind of like brutal. So that's like Joburg on its surface. But then you start engaging, especially with people, suddenly turns Joburg into this really interesting urban habitat of all these lives and stories and people. And you can unpack them, but you can only unpack them, I think, if you want to understand what lies behind. And then at some point, you can make them yours. If you unpack all these layers, then you can become part of that. And I think that was really the complex beauty I found.
Thati, in a 2016 interview by Tish, you referenced Joburg as a place that gave you the certainty that you can accomplish anything that you set your mind to. You went on to describe Joburg as vibrant, politically engaged, and alive.
You know, it's been so beautiful listening to somebody describe their first time being in Joburg. When I was younger, really took it for granted because you experience Joburg in so many different ways. I experienced Soweto, I experienced the 10 blocks that I was surrounded by when we moved to the northern suburbs. I experienced being naughty and going to buy weed in the CBD. But Joburg, if you want to experience people and the beauty of people, for me, there's very a few other cities, and you can give that to you like Joburg can, because it's such a melting pot in all different types of classes. And it's a city of greeters. Joburg is a city of greeters, and it's a city of people from different places that allow you to be a Joburger. Like New York, you have to work to be a New Yorker. You don't have to work to be a Joburger. You live here, you're a Joburger.
Can we go on to your thesis? Its medium being film, a short film, its protagonist being the youngest character, the rural black girl child. I mean, something that struck me was that her mother was absent.
Yes.
And so you get this really interesting dynamic between a young girl child and a single father. Can I just get your initial feelings around how she became your central node? What is her significance in being the youngest but the main character?
The thesis came with me trying to understand myself. And so I wanted to write about a version of myself because I was in New York and a little bit alone and a little bit lonely of what it would be like to be in the place that I felt safest. And that was always Klawani. It was always the Northwest where my grandparents and my parents were from. And because I've always had a complicated relationship with my father, he was always going to be a central role in that. My relationship with my mother is colorful, but has always been safe. But I needed to write about the relationship with my father. And to do so, needed to exclude my mother from that conversation as well.
Lerato's father is not absent, but is overwhelmed.
Yes.
He's also a guy that smokes a joint during working hours.
Yeah.
Can you take me a little bit into the character building and development of Lerato's father? Please remind me of his name.
Happy.
Happy, yes.
Yeah. You know, there's an interesting point that Nisha just made now about Sophie being visible, and that you were saying that you saw images of her all around the city and her being seen. And it's so rare that we see single dads but also so rare that we really address how the toll of a father-daughter relationship, or not the toll rather, but what a father-daughter relationship can do to a young woman, how incredibly patriarchal South Africa is, how we talk about it but we don't, and how it's okay for dads to be like half-assed dads. And I really wanted to have a discussion about that for the one part. But the second part was also, at that time, there was also a lot of talks about how farm laborers were just being unfairly dismissed, how farmers were not making enough money, how there were also farm killings happening at the same time. And I was interested in that because, again, all of my weekends were spent in the Northwest, even though I'm a Joburger. My uncle is a farmer, and my dad, in his soul, really was a farmer as well. So that was, it just felt like a natural thing to do. And then from a very practical perspective, it was beautiful. And I needed to go back to the place that I felt safest, and that was the wide open spaces and the cows and speaking Setswana and just being my little self. And that's where it all came together.
I also found it beautiful that the tension was centered around the artistic ability of this little girl. The competing pressures of how much of her talent do we harness? How soon do we give her access to a stage? What does it cost to gain access to stages? And ultimately, in her journey towards the stage, they make it to their destination late, too late. But there still is the grand performance just between the daughter and the father being the only audience member, and then at the end asking her to play again as she plays the piano. Can we talk about, that tension of artistic, creative ability, potential, talent, what pressures it puts on families to allow a child to take an unconventional route?
Yeah, and again, it was really like catharsis for me because to go back to this long story of me becoming a filmmaker was a fight between myself and I say my dad, but really it was myself and my fears. It's also a story that wouldn't have been able to happen if it didn't take me so long to get into my master's, if it wasn't so hard, if all the scholarships that I applied for weren't saying things to me like, but why do you need to do a master's in film? And we don't need more filmmakers, we need more engineers. So I think that tension, because I had this brilliant, brilliant writing teacher called Mick Cassell, and he always asked, what's the story about? And I said, a little girl who wants to play the piano. And he's like, what's the story really about? And I'm like, well, the socioeconomic pressures of what it is to be poor in South Africa and wanting to do something artistic. And then he's like, what's the story really about? I'm like, a child wanting to be seen by the people that she loves for doing something that she loves. And that was me at the time. I just wanted to be seen. It was a very selfish pursuit, I won't lie, for me to continue being a filmmaker. It was not choking me, but it was in my throat for years. And it had to come out, and it came out as a short film.
This theme of being seen, but also seeing and then responding to emotional reminders or flags that come out of us from being presented by something we see. What is it about watching or looking at something?
I've never gravitated towards the written word. I love to read, but I don't naturally write. It's actually quite a struggle for me. I love seeing things because I suppose I needed people to really see that this was not right about Lerato being like 7-year-old Lerato Mulefe lived in Kabane with her dad in a 2-room house. I needed you to see it, and that she bathed in a zinc dish and it sounded like water splashing on a tin roof every time she washed in it. I needed you to see it.
In season 2, I'm foregrounding Joburg in many of the interviews, both in terms of international people that come to South Africa and settle and live localized lives in Johannesburg, but also in terms of Joburgers going abroad. This project, Are We Our Work, is a middle class project. And I think we must just be honest about that. It is.
Can I read something from a text?
Mm.
It was something that stuck with me when I was listening to the episode, and I want to just read a little portion of it that I think links to both of their works. It's a piece by Françoise Vergès. It's titled Race, Gender, and Exhaustion as a Condition of Existence.
When was it published?
2019. It's about the invisible forces that keep capitalist society alive, that keeps the city in operation. So she writes, every day in every urban center of the world, thousands of black and brown women, invisible, are opening the city. They clean the spaces necessary for neo-patriarchy and neoliberal finance capitalism to function. They are doing dangerous work. They inhale toxic chemical products and push or carry heavy loads. They have usually traveled long hours in the early morning or late at night, and their work is underpaid and considered to be unskilled. They are usually in their 40s or 50s. A second group, which shares with the first an intersection of race, class, and gender, go to middle class homes to cook, clean, and take care of children and the elderly, so that those who employ them can go to work in the places that the former group of women have cleaned. Meanwhile, in the same early hours of the morning, in the same big metropoles of the world, we can see women and men running through the streets, rushing to the nearest gym or yoga center. They follow the mandate to maintain healthy and clean bodies of late capitalism. They usually follow their run or workout with a shower, an avo toast, a detox drink before heading to their clean offices. The working body that is made visible is the concern of an ever-growing industry dedicated to the cleanliness and healthiness of body and mind to better serve racial capitalism. So I come to this because I think about it a lot in relation to the visibilization, the making visible of Sophie through the work of Mary Sibande, through the process of transcending from the invisible black body doing labor to the now visible black body celebrated for this labor, celebrated for becoming visible in a way.
I specifically wanted to go into that conversation via a cultural landscape and via a artistic context, because I think there's something interesting there. This is not trying to speak on behalf of domestic workers. It is trying to recognize domestic workers. It will inherently be from a problematic lens because it is from a middle class perspective. But the point is to allow for inclusion in terms of discourse and analysis, however bourgeois that may be.
What do we understand about the spaces, the context that we're operating
It's world building.
It's world building.
Which I think is important if we are going to analyze our lives and ourselves in our lives.
In thinking about how Nisha finds a way to work through the complexities of Mary Sibande's Sophie to make visible the invisible, and then this connects also to Thati and the film, the little girl, to Lerato, trying to find recognition for that which she loves, and then the kind of moving from the rural landscape into the city. There's something about the relationship between the city and the visibility, even though in a big city like Johannesburg, like New York, even Berlin, it becomes also a space where you can become invisible because there is so much happening. There are so many people, there are so many people hustling, so many people trying to make it, to become known, to become visible. It actually maybe is a bit harder in the city. It's both easier and harder in an interesting way. In listening to this conversation, or I suppose the key ideas that stuck with me are around love, recognition, and visibility.
What I wanted to do with this episode in particular was draw out the love that goes into a thesis / dissertation. I wanted to frame as work and as a moment of identity birth. And it's an incredibly daunting, scary, exhilarating time of discovery and pain. And especially when you choose to do your master's degree abroad, which both Thati and Nisha did.
The thesis project it's something that, it's a complex one. It's an intense period of study, of focus, of reading, of researching, of making, sitting
Also,
with yourself.
To stop following. It's one of the first times in life where you're asked, what is your opinion?
Yes.
What do
you
think?
Want to do, to write about, to speak about?
Which is breaking over 15 years of hardcore education system drilling into us to copy what has been written down from the board?
I want to connect this just to context and decontextualizing. So Nisha writes from here, Thati writes from a distance, right? To come from a place, to write from a place. So what does it mean to work from a place, from a distance, in order to reapproach yourself? And I think that they've both approached it in such beautiful, powerful ways.
I agree. And it makes me think a lot about what is birth and rebirth. I like that they're having the same conversations on opposite ends of the scale.
I was thinking maybe we could talk a little bit about falling in love with Joburg, falling out of love with Joburg, the desire to make from a place like Joburg. And I loved, Nisha calls it complex beauty.
Thati, and I quote her from an interview with NYU Tisch School, frames Johannesburg specifically as a place within which dreams are a prominent feature to your life here. It's very possible and okay, and if anything, encouraged to dream. If Joburg is a breeding ground of dreams, is that not a society of dreamers? And what does that do to the day-to-day interaction we have with ourselves and with one another? And I'm not trying to over-romanticize. Please don't get me wrong.
I like this. Yeah, this not quite romantic, but romantic idea of Joburg as a breeding ground of dreams and also a breeding ground of realities.
Yeah, okay. Thanks.
Are We Our Work is an independent research project and podcast anthology series centered around questions of love, fulfillment, relationships, identities, and work, co-hosted by Nadira Patel and myself, Kimubu Cielo. This episode was produced and edited by Tiffany Ibrahim, sound design by Joao Orekia, music by Vuma Levine, illustration by Softwork Studio, and web design by Sky Quadling. To stay up to date with the project, please check out Are We Our Work on Instagram.
And keep listening.
Yes, this is not goodbye. See you later.